All right, so welcome everyone. Everyone is on Zoom, which is fabulous. So it's great to see you all, and I'm glad that you're here for this session on preparing for your preliminary exams in agricultural and human sciences. We are really excited as a faculty. We've been working really hard and we're continuing to work on our preliminary exam guidance and the process. And so we are going to be sharing some things with you today about studying and preparing for your exams. But please know that in the coming weeks, we'll have some additional materials available for you all. And I'll share a little bit about what those are as well. But I'm Hardison-Moody. I think that I know everyone on here. I'm the Director of Graduate Programs in Agricultural and Human Sciences, and thank you all for joining us. So here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk a little bit about the process of the exam, preparing to study, how you study and thinking about how you do that, how you prepare for the oral parts of your exam, and then really thinking about self-care and what that might look like for you. So I do want to share that we're going to start with the exam process itself. And there is information in our handbook currently about the preliminary exams in AHS. And those include, it's a 4-part exam that is done in a closed book setting. And there are 4 different parts of the exam that generally are the role of the preliminary exams is to move you forward as a scholar and as a researcher, and to demonstrate to the faculty and to your committee that you are ready for this next stage of research and work in your doctoral program. And so we have decided as a faculty that there should be 4 kind of parts of that, that foundational knowledge that you have in studying for your preliminary exams. And so this is a little bit of clarification from what you'll see in the handbook. And as I mentioned, we're working really hard as a faculty to provide, we're going to have some additional clarifications in the handbook that will be coming out very soon in the coming weeks. We're just wordsmithing a few final things as part of that. But we've worked on this, the 4 different parts of the exam to help you all see how they're different. Because one of the things that I heard and that we heard from student comments on a recent survey that we did about comprehensive exams is there were some questions about the different areas of the exam and how those work together. So part 1 of the exam is really the foundational part of the exam. And so we're thinking about history and philosophy. We have lots of disciplines in our department. And so students might say, well, what do you mean by like the history and philosophy of what discipline or of what area of focus? And so, in this part, in part 1, as in all of the exam process, you're really going to be working closely with your advisor and with your committee members to understand how they see each of these parts working out for you, and for you to share with them what you think are kind of foundational questions or foundational texts that might fall into each of these areas. Because again, our goal is for this exam process, it's not meant to be something that is just done like as a checkbox. It's meant to be something where you are able to reflect on all that you've learned, where you're able to pull it all together, and where you're able to demonstrate your knowledge as a scholar and someone who can analyze, not only like memorize things, but analyze what you've learned and take it on to the next level. So part 1, that history and philosophy section, you're going to look at, maybe you're in agricultural education or maybe you're in extension education. So your foundational texts, those like history and philosophy texts, will come from your specific discipline or area of focus. And for that part, for part 1 of the exam, will cover history, foundational theories, and philosophies that ground that area of specialization. And part 2 is the application of theory. So if we think about part 1 as like history and philosophy, that's you understanding what are those core concepts, what are those core theorists who you need to know in your field. Part 2 is asking you, how do you put that into practice? How do you think about what that looks like, whether it's in extension, whether it's in the educational setting, whether it's in the community? So we're going to ask you in part 2 of the exam to think about how you would apply some of those theoretical principles from your area to the work or research that you want to do. So we put some examples in here. That could be things like designing a syllabus or designing an educational program, and justifying the kinds of content that you would use in that particular, let's say you're designing a syllabus. Why would you include the readings that you would include on that syllabus? Why are they important or foundational? Or why are they an important part of critique of the field, right? It could be thinking about curriculum development, and thinking about what would curriculum development or what should it look like in light of these theoretical understandings. And it could look like thinking about the integration of technology. But basically, you can see with this question, we're really going to ask you to take not only like what you've learned, but how does that work in the real world? How does that work in the field that you're going to be moving into? Part 3 of the exam is focused on research methods, and it will cover your comprehension of research methods that are relevant to your dissertation research. However, we want you to be able to apply and interpret research broadly. So obviously in our field and in your doctoral program, you are doing coursework in quantitative methods, and so we want you to be able to evaluate research broadly. So not just in one particular area of research, whether that's quantitative or qualitative, to be able to interpret findings, to be able to have a basic understanding of the ways that research is conducted, but also like analyzed and evaluated. And this part, like the other parts, can also be specialized to your area of research or your interest. But as I mentioned, all students should be able to demonstrate kind of basic knowledge of research methods across both, which is what we cover in, if you think about this in terms of coursework, you're thinking about 578, you're thinking about stats, your stats courses, you're thinking about 777 or other qualitative courses that you've taken. And then part 4 is focused on the student's area of research. So this is, we used to have this in the handbook as a minor area of study, which was very confusing to students because they were like, I don't have a minor. So what we mean here is that this one really needs to be focused on your particular niche of your research, the thing that makes you Martellus, or the thing that makes you Tammy, the unique area that you are studying or focusing on in your program. So that could be built out from your dissertation project. Maybe it's a particular theory that's very important to your dissertation project that you didn't cover in parts 1 or part 2. Or it's something that might be relevant, like let's say a particular model or a particular application of theory or a particular kind of curriculum that you didn't already cover in part 2. That could be the focus of part 4. However, if you do have a minor, so if you are declaring a graduate minor, let's say you're doing a minor in women's gender and sexuality studies, or you're doing a minor in another department, this exam should be in your minor area, and you must have a committee member who is from that department or from that minor program. So, for example, if you were in Parks, Rec, and Tourism Management, you would have to have a committee member from that area, and that committee member would write that question related to part 4. So that's the basics of kind of what's covered in the exams. Before I move to how to get started in terms of thinking about your exams, how to get started in terms of studying for these exams, does anyone have questions, or any faculty members who are on the call, if anybody wants to offer any clarifications or things that I might have missed or should point out when we talk about just the overview of the exams?
So I guess, and this could just be, I'm just getting started, so I don't know all the things. Are these like, is it one really like essay kind of based question for each of these categories, or what, or are there parameters around that? Like what does the format look like, I guess is what I'm asking.
That is a great question. And the format has looked different for different students and committee members. And I'm going to ask, I see Dr. Park might have stepped away, but I'll ask Dr. Warner to chime in if I miss anything or to clarify anything. But for example, so for some for some examiners, you might just have one question that you're answering for the part 1 exam, or you might have 2 questions that you're answering. Sometimes an examiner will give you 4 or 5 questions and say, pick 2 or pick 3 of these to answer. And so maybe they've designed a question that can be answered in a shorter period of time. So they might say, pick 3 of these and answer it within that 4-hour time period that you're writing on these questions.
So it's really up to the.
It is. Yes.
Dr. Hardison-Moody, I was going to add too, that was Mary Kate, I was thinking of that same question before you ask it. Commonly, I've seen, so for each part, what's been kind of common practice is to have 4 questions, and they recommend that you write an hour per question. But to Dr. Hardison-Moody's point, it is changing. Some might just ask a large, broad, overarching question in which you would have that 4 hours of writing, and maybe that's a step back. Generally, when you set these up, it's over a period of 4 days where you write for 4 hours a day, and that can be structured. Some students knock it out in a week. Some students do it over 2 weeks. So they might write one day and then take a day off, and then write another day, take another day off, and then finish up the following week. So that'll be a conversation to have with your advisor and your committee as to how you'll structure taking the exam.
Thank you.
And Taylor has a question about when this usually happens in the process, which is a great question. So I was on my phone because I wanted to pull up exactly what the graduate school says, because I think it's important to be clear. And just so that you all always know this as well, a lot of things are laid out in the NC State graduate handbook. So you're also welcome, or you're always welcome to look there first, but we will be putting all of this guidance in our handbook as well, and that will be updated soon. So so you all will have this too. But so students take their preliminary exams after they have completed their coursework. And all doctoral students must attain candidacy for the degree within 4 years of starting their program, or after they've completed 48 hours of coursework. So those are the kind of programmatic parameters that you're working with in terms of your preliminary written exams. And that's, if they fall outside of those parameters, that's where we have to get an exception from the graduate school if we're falling outside of that candidacy requirement. And the other great thing is Desiree keeps wonderful schedules of like when people are due for things. So we're also checking in on that from our departmental side as well. But for those of you who are in the coursework process, who maybe are starting your coursework, or maybe you're at the part where you're thinking about coming to the end of your coursework, that's the time where it's really critical for you to begin, if you haven't already, talking with your committee about your exams. So speaking of, let's talk about getting started, because I think some folks might have some questions that come up here as well. So the important thing here as you work on getting started with your preliminary exams and scheduling those and studying for them is to meet with your committee. So you want to set up meeting times with each of your committee members to understand, as Dr. Warner said, like what their expectations are and what the structure that they're expecting for their exam. So for example, typically you'll have a committee member who will write for each of the questions. So if you have 4 committee members, typically what happens is a committee member will take each of the parts of the exam. And so you'll want to meet with each of the members of your committee to understand which part of the exam will they be covering, what are how have they structured exams in the past, what are potential exam topics, potential questions or readings that you should focus on. So talking with them early is really important to understand how they think about the exam process and what they think you should be focused on. Something that's very exciting is that we have been working as a faculty to develop a list of some sample past exam questions or some sample exam questions And that will be coming soon in the next 2 weeks. It will be coming hopefully by the end of the semester or by the before winter break officially starts. So we've been working on that. That sample exam question document that you all will get a link to. It's just a starting point. It's meant to be a starting point for you to understand, you know, like Mary Kate said, like you don't even know what you don't know, you know, like what does this even look like? What is this? What is this thing that you're going to be expected to do? Is it multiple choice? Is it essays? Like what is a preliminary exam? So so we're gonna have that sample exam question for the parts of the exam. And I think that will be very helpful for you all to have as you start those conversations to be able to see, okay, do you see me needing to focus on this or that? So having those meetings regularly is important. As you are meeting with the faculty members who will be giving each part of your exam, start working on your personal bibliography for each of those questions. I did push record. I can't just double check. Recording. Yes, okay. I get so paranoid. Oh no. Okay, so developing your own personal bibliography for each of the questions and discuss with your committee members what that bibliography should be comprised of. This is another really exciting thing that I'm so glad that we've been working on as a faculty is we have been starting some bibliographies for you all. And so again, we will be sharing those in the next 2 weeks. These bibliographies are meant to be a starting point for you to start working with those committee members to see what they would like for you to focus on or the materials that they feel like are most relevant for you, your project, and your exam. You should know that the list that we're going to send you, that's not exhaustive. That doesn't mean like these are all the things that you need to know, period, stop, and end. It means a starting point in the same way that you would have a starting point with a syllabus. And you know that as you get into the literature, you're probably going to need to read more things. You're going to need to add more things to your bibliography. So you will need to read beyond that starting bibliography to cover relevant materials. We encourage you to, at this point, reach out to our research librarians. We have incredible research librarians in CALS who are willing, happy, excited to be able to help you with this study process as well. So if you tell them, this is what I'm working on, here's my starting bibliography, how do I search for example, how do I search for review articles in my discipline? How do I know, how do I search for additional materials that I might need to know? How do I know that my search is thorough enough? These are the kinds of things that our research librarians want to help you out with. So don't feel like you have to do that alone. You can obviously ask your committee members, but you can also reach out to the research librarians. I would also encourage you to chat with other students who have taken their exams. Everyone's process is going to be different, as we mentioned earlier, but it's great to hear about what went well for other students, what they wish they'd known, their tips for preparation, their tips for studying. So if you need help getting in touch with a student who has taken their exams, we're happy to help you connect with somebody and chat with them about how they've studied. And then also talk with your advisor about how you will be evaluated for the exam. Another thing that we'll be able to share, I'd hope that all of these things would be ready by now, but as you can guess, like we've been creating a lot of new things, so it's taken a lot of time, but they'll be ready in just a couple of weeks. We have drafted some rubrics for the exams so that you will have a better sense, or you will have a sense about how you will be evaluated. But I encourage all of you, as you're meeting with your committee members, to sit down with them with those rubrics to understand, again, what are their expectations, and talk through those rubric guidance and specifics. The rubrics will cover things, they're not specific in terms of the actual knowledge that you should know, they're very general in terms of, well, is the student able to not only comprehend material, but analyze that material at like a higher level? Are they including the sources? Are they covering what was asked in the question? Are they covering, if the question asks them to cover 2 to 3 theorists, are they doing that? So those are just some tips for getting started with the exam process. And the biggest one is to meet early and often with your advisor and your committee members to really talk through what you should be doing.
Dr. Hardison-Moody, can I add one
Yes.
other thing too? So I think also along these lines, I mean, your committee members, you should have taken courses with them.
Yeah.
So pulling up those notes and kind of organizing that content and refreshing yourself as to what were the key points. Like I was just sitting here thinking, if you took methods of technological change with Dr. Donaldson and he was on your committee, chances, there's a likely probability that you're going to have to write about the diffusion of an innovation on your exam. So there is that part of it too, that these are reflective of your coursework. So they're not just being drawn out of the universe or the atmosphere, that having your notes and your resources organized from the courses that you've taken with your faculty members are also going to be really helpful and a good starting point for a conversation with them about what might be some content to expect on your exams.
That is such a great point. And it's another thing that we've talked a lot about as a faculty is for those of you students who are early in the process and maybe thinking about, maybe you haven't gotten to who might be on your committee yet, or you, but even making sure that you're taking courses with folks who will be on your committee so that you have a sense of the kinds of things they teach or the kinds of questions they might ask you or the kinds of things they might want you to integrate, whether it's your dissertation or your exams. But yes, absolutely. You're not starting from nothing. You're starting from all of the coursework. And the goal of this is for us to understand, well, what have you learned and how can you, I remember like my advisor explained it to me as, well, these are the things that we're saying as a faculty that we feel comfortable with you going out and teaching and like going out and teaching other people. And so obviously you've learned them here, you've learned them in your coursework, and starting with that is absolutely a great first step. So let's talk about how you study for the preliminary exams. Because this is a different kind of studying. It is a more intense form of studying. So in some ways, like Dr. Warner said, you know a lot of this because you've taken the coursework, but we're asking you to do something with the coursework that is at that higher level of not just did you learn something, but taking it to that next level of how would you apply it? How do you analyze this? What's your place in literature? So not just what do you think of what does this theorist say, but what do you, Mary Kate, think about what this theorist says? What are your critiques? What's your analysis of this person's point? So it is a more intense form of studying, and we encourage you to make a schedule. So if you start with your exam date, if you know from your advisor, your committee members, when your written exam is going to be, work backwards from your exam date and start prepping. Look at the materials. As Dr. Warner said, go back to your syllabi. I had a notebook. I was going to bring it down here because I can't get rid of it. It's like this security blanket of mine. Like I cannot get rid of my exam study notebook. I don't know why, but I can't. So I had a 3-ring binder because it was the olden days. And I had my 3-ring binder and I had my 4 exam areas, and I had, to Dr. Warner's point, in each of my areas, I had the syllabi from relevant courses were in that folder for each of the exams. I had the bibliography that I developed. I had any articles that I had pulled that were not, because I read a lot of books. And so once you've gathered all of your materials together, you need to take out your calendar and then figure out how you are going to kind of map the materials, map the review that you have to do with the time that you have. Some of that could be, to Dr. Warner's point, some of it could be reviewing. Some of it could be, okay, I need to make time in my schedule to go back and look at my materials from 578, and maybe it's going to take me X amount of time for me to go back to my research methods materials and look through those books, make some additional notes, and maybe I'm going to have some additional reading that I'm going to have to do as well. So I know that I have this book or that book or these research articles or these review articles that I need to add for my research methods exam. Once you know what you need to do, you've got to map it onto your time. And I know that especially a lot of folks, actually, almost everyone on this call is, or a lot of our graduate students are part-time. And so you're not only balancing the expectations of your full-time job, but you're balancing the expectations of studying along with any personal expectations and family life that you have. That's the same for our assistantship students who are working on your assistantship. You're balancing your family and your schedule. So this is a complex thing that you're having to figure out. And so making a schedule is very helpful. If you are the kind of person who likes to be with other people and to study together, if you know that others are taking their exams around the same time period, or maybe even within the same like general semester, forming study groups could be a good way to encourage each other. We're happy to help facilitate that at the department level. So if you'd like some support, or if you want to know, hey, I'm planning on doing my exams fall of 24. Is anybody else going to be studying and working towards exams in that period? I'd love to chat with them. And even I found, I did a lot of writing groups when I was working on my dissertation, and I did those groups with people who were not in my field necessarily even, but we would just sit together and write or work. And it's just nice sometimes because studying for your exams can be a very solitary practice. So even just being in the same room as somebody else can be helpful. We all know the dangers of isolation and how it was not good for any of us when we were going through that during the pandemic. One thing that, and this is really important, that Dr. Schulman in our department pointed out is that exam or any other kind of study group or writing group needs to be set up for positive solidarity. So if you find that you are a part of a study group or maybe a writing group that is making you feel bad about yourself, or that is making you feel bad about your process, it's okay to leave that study group, and it's okay to step away. So if you find that a study group isn't like fueling your process and it doesn't feel good to you, you do not have to be, obviously nobody has to be a part of a study group, but we did just want to point that out because I don't think that this is the case in our department, but you can see how when you're getting together and you start to say, oh, I'm reading this or I'm reading this, and people start comparing what they're reading, how much they're reading, if that kind of thing happens, you don't have to be a part of it, or you can encourage that to not be the practice of the group, or you can set group guidelines for a study group. So anyway, Dr. Schulman pointed that out, and I think it's really important for us to mention. Another thing, as you are working on studying for your exams, and this is something that our new sample exam questions can help you with, is consider taking a practice exam laying that out during your exam process, during your exam schedule, scheduling in a practice exam or two, and scheduling that practice exam in as close to the same environment and situation that you will be taking the exam as possible. So most students will be taking their exams in our department in a conference room, probably in a closed space. If we can help you with that, you can reach out to me, Dr. Warner, to Desiree, to James, to Jerry, to schedule a space for you to take a practice exam. And you can do it at the library, you can do it yourself, you can turn off your internet and take a practice exam, but that's a really good practice because a lot of us experience test anxiety, and a lot of us feel a ton of pressure when you're taking an exam like this, or when you're doing something like this that is so high stakes. And so if you can build in practices where your body gets used to what this feels like, where your body gets used to, okay, this is what I'm going to be doing, I'm okay, I'm safe, I'm fine. If you can do that, that can help you on the day of the exam as well. One of the things that we're going to be doing, so for those of you who are like early in the doctoral program process, is I'm going to be teaching our 700, our new like foundations doctoral course, and we're going to build in a practice exam into that course so that students will have the ability to take a practice exam. And if any of you want to come and sit in on that practice exam this fall, like even if you're not in 700, you've already, but you're past that point, and but you maybe want to practice exam for a class, you're welcome to do that. And the questions, the sample questions that I told you all, those would be great to use for your practice exam. So you can use one of the sample questions that we're going to be sharing. Let's see. After you've done that practice exam, read through your exam, read through your question, or read through your response. Think about things that you've missed. That's your point when you can go back to the literature and say, oh, you know, like I should have put X in, or I should have added Y, but with it being a closed book exam, I didn't have that. And so that's another way of like refreshing and retraining your brain when you read through the things that you've already done to say, okay, here are the things that I need to add back in next time. It's also a place for you to look at your argument. So one of the things that we want to see when you're writing an exam response is that you have an argument, that you have a statement to make. The exam, I feel like I just keep saying this same thing, is it's our opportunity to see you as a scholar. So it's your move from like student to scholar. And you're always a scholar, obviously, but I mean in the sense of like, this is another thing that my advisor told me is like, this is the point where we really start thinking about you more as a colleague than as our student, where we see you able to demonstrate a higher level of knowledge and analysis over the text. So we want to see that in your response. So when you read back over your practice response, do you have a clear argument? Do you make a statement about a particular theorist if you were asked to make one? That can help you too to continue like to refine your writing process as well. So this is it's another form of writing. Thinking about what good study habits are, the Writing Center, the Graduate Writing Center has great resources and videos on active studying, note-taking, backwards planning, all sorts of things that you can use. Sometimes I feel like it's hard to know, like, what do you do when you study? And so for me, I'll share some things that I did when I was studying, and I don't know, Dr. Werner, if you want to chime in, or anybody else. But I wrote lots of memos. So I would read a book and then I would write a book memo basically. And it would be like 2 pages, single spaced, on what was the key argument of the book. What were some of the important points that the author was making? How did that fit into the broader literature? Why was it important for my research? And so I had a series, like those are kind of some big questions that you want to be asking yourself about the things that you're reading. Another thing to know is when you have a lot of content to read, you're not going to be able to read it all the same way. You're not going to be able to read everything as in-depth as you want to. And so if you can adopt some studying habits and skills that help you to, for example, again, with a book, a lot of times what I'll do, and this is similar to an article, is read the introduction, or I'll read the abstract, I'll read the introduction, I'll read the conclusion to sort of understand, okay, is this something that I really need to dive deep into, or is this something that I can skim and make a few notes on? And if it's something that I need to dive in and really understand, then I will write a memo about it. Because I write to learn. And so you might learn other ways, but I write to learn. If it's something that I feel like, okay, I don't need to do this as in-depth, maybe I will write a quick outline, write a short blurb about it, cite a few pieces. And some people do this, you can use different programs for it, like you can use Zotero, you can annotate your PDFs. There are all sorts of ways that people do this that are probably way better than my antiquated method of writing memos and printing them out in my 3-ring binder.
I like it.
Yeah. Now they're in my Google Docs, at least they're not in the 3-ring binder. So once you have this plan, you've started your study habits, sticking to that plan is really important. Again, all of you have very busy lives. You have lots of demands on your time. You have lots of things going on, but you need to be realistic and check in with yourself regularly about where you are in the process, how things are going. And please, please, please be in touch with your advisor and with your committee members if things are not going the way that you had hoped or the way that you had planned. It's very hard for us to it's hard, and it's not very hard. It's harder for us to make a change, to move dates, to reorient things when it's later on in the process. If you can let us know, the sooner the better. If things are not going to plan, or if you feel like you're struggling, like you feel like I still don't quite know how to study. What am I doing wrong? I don't feel like I'm reading the right things. Please talk to your advisor, please talk to your committee members. And if you feel like that process isn't working, please reach out to me or Dr. Warner. If we can be a support for you, we are happy to do that and to help you out as well. Any questions about the studying process before we talk about actually writing for your exams? Or any advice? All right, so let's talk about taking the exam. An important thing to think about is I want you to think about your exams and your responses to the questions that you receive at the way that you do about other pieces of academic writing. So again, we want to see that you know the material, but more importantly, that you can apply and or analyze what you've learned. So as you think about this, you want to think about the argument. Like I said earlier, it's not just that you can regurgitate information, but it's that you have something to say about it, that you have a point of view, that you have an argument, that you have a critique, that you have an analysis, that you see how this piece fits in the broader literature. I really struggle. Like I came from a field where everyone's like a critic. And that's what you do and what you do at conferences. I'm not a critic. I'm a bringer together, a synthesizer. And so for me, that's my argument. I would look in my world to see, how do things fit together? How is this a part of a bigger conversation about X, Y, or Z? So it doesn't have to be that you're picking apart a theorist. It can be, oh, well, I see how this person really moved the field forward, or really, when we put this person in conversation with that person, that's something new that you are bringing to the literature that other people might not see. So that's what we mean by argument, that you have something to say. Another thing, this was something that Dr. Schulman said, and I think it's a really good point, is sometimes when we sit down to write, you get really hung up on how to start. So you get really hung up on especially when you're doing something that's timed, you can get really hung up on, okay, I need to make this particular statement, or I need to create my introduction statement. Don't get hung up on that, especially because you are taking these exams during a timed period. Start writing. If you feel yourself getting stuck, start writing what you know. So look at the question and think about the things that you read, think about the things that you know. Go ahead and write them down. Take some time to brainstorm. Some people brainstorm. I brainstorm best by hand. So if you need to brainstorm by hand, make sure with your advisor that they have a notepad in there for you and a pen. So maybe just start brainstorming by hand, because I can't stand looking at a blank page on the computer. So I like to write things by hand, or sometimes I'll do like an audio note and then I transcribe those, and that gets me started writing. So when you're in the moment, don't get hung up on how you begin, just start writing, and then you can move through. And as you see kind of where you're going and maybe making an outline, or maybe working through some points, you can go back to your introduction. So citation, when you're taking a closed book exam, you should cite as much as possible. So if you can, for example, remember the exact title of a book, and the author's full name, cite that using APA style, cite as much as you can. Your advisor and your committee will often give you time between your written exam and your oral exam to go back and enter in the citations. Like, for example, if you wanted to enter, of course, most of us will not remember a complete page number. There probably are some people who will remember page numbers, maybe. That is not me. So they'll give you an opportunity to go back in and include those page numbers. But when you are citing, when you're talking about a particular theorist or a source, use as much citation as you know, and then fill those in before your oral exam. Let's see. The goal of the exam and the goal for us reading the exam is for your committee to understand that you know the literature and the relevant authors or concepts or theories for the particular question. So be sure that you are, for example, if they're asking you about the key theorists who have written about XYZ theory, don't just write about XYZ theory without naming those people, because we want to see that you know who those people are and how they fit in. Again, that doesn't mean that you have to know the page number of that particular book that they were writing. But in general, as a part of your study process, this is where that memoing or outlining of the materials that you're looking at is very helpful. Knowing those key texts that you need to know and being able to say that was in, I can't even think of a book on Monday. Anyway, that was in this book and by that author, is very important if that's what we're asking you to do for that question. There are lots of great resources for writing skills at the Graduate Writing Center, so I encourage you all to check these out, and I will send you all I'll send all doctoral students the link to the resources page as well from the Writing Center. But those are some tips for taking the exam. Another thing that we will share with you all is that we're putting into our exam guidance is they are closed book exams, and we recognize that, you know, that can cause some test anxiety for folks. And so if there are ways or if there are things that we can do to make the process better for you or feel better for you, like for example, if you have of course, if you have any if you have any complications that we need to deal with or that we need to work through with the Office of Disability Services, we can definitely work through that. But I'm also thinking about things like it would help to have a standing desk, you know, because maybe your back really hurts if you're sitting for 4 hours at a desk. Please let your advisor know or let Dr. Warner or Desiree or I know. And we don't want this to be a painful, it is a bit of a painful process. We don't want it to be more painful or unnecessarily painful. And so I want to talk, so that was a little bit about taking the written exam. Now I want to talk a little bit about the oral exam before talking about self-care and then opening up for questions. So for the preliminary oral exam, some ways to prepare for that is to first off, read over your written exam. So read over what you read, what you submitted. As I said, that's a point where you can work with your advisor and your committee members to clarify citations. For example, usually they'll let you enter in correct citations for things if you missed any of those. But with your oral exam, the committee will ask you questions about what you've written. So you want to be very familiar with what you've written and what you said. They might ask you to clarify some points that you've made. Obviously, we know you can't write everything in 4 hours. So we might ask you to elaborate on some things that you started out in your written exam. So take notes as you're rereading your written rereading your written exam. Take notes of things that you would like to clarify. Take notes of things that you already know that you missed, so that when you're in that oral exam, you already know, okay, they're probably gonna ask me about this because I didn't cover it as much as I wanted to. So let me go ahead and prepare that. Let's see, take notes of places where you could have added additional citations and or theories that you didn't mention in the written exam, and make note of those and be prepared to share those in your oral exam. Refresh your study notes again to refresh your memory on key concepts or points that you might be asked about. And this is particularly important. Like, let's say that you talked with a committee member who said, I'm probably going to ask you about this concept and maybe this concept, or maybe they listed 3 to 4 things and they asked you questions about 2 of those. I would refresh my notes on the other 2 that they said that they might ask you about, in case there are things that weren't covered in your exam that they might ask you about. And the last thing to say in preparing for your oral exam is to take a deep breath and remember that you've done this, you've written, We know that this is a stressful process as your faculty and the people who are supporting you. We want you to succeed. So our department, we don't see this process. It's not intended to be, like I said earlier, it is painful because you're asked to really reflect on like almost your whole academic career, the things that you have learned, the things that you have dedicated your years of your life to study. So it's very hard, but we don't want you to be unnecessarily stressed or in pain about this process. We want you to succeed. So whatever it is that you need to do to feel grounded in the moment, when you're in that oral exam, when you're with your committee members and they're asking you questions, do that. For example, if you need to bring your favorite coffee in with you just to have, or if you need to have, like me today, I have this like sweater that Dr. Warner and I were just talking about. It's like a blanket to me and it feels very cozy. And when I'm feeling nervous, I can put my hands in my pockets. Do that. Bring those things, wear those things to your oral exam. But also if you need a minute to take before you answer a question, take a minute. If you need to write something down before you answer a question, take that time. Don't feel like you have to respond to something right away. So know that we want you to succeed. Take a deep breath. You've answered the questions. We want to hear about how you've answered them and any elaborations that you have. But we want to do that in a way that is supportive for you. And related to that, before we go to questions, I do really want you to think about practices of self-care during the process, before, during, and all the way through the process. This is an important aspect. Like I didn't know if I should put this at the beginning or if I should put it at the end. It really needs to be something that you think about all through your graduate career. And I don't mean self-care, like I realize that self-care has become this individualized thing that we ask people to do on top of something else. Oh, well, just take care of yourself and go, have a spa day or whatever it is. We're trying as a department to create an exam process that integrates care and that is supportive for students. So recognizing that institutionally as an important part of the process, but also helping you to think about, and I encourage you to talk with your advisor, talk with your committee members, talk with other students about the practices that help to sustain you during this process, because it's really rigorous and it can be difficult. So first, think about your self-care plan as you're making your study plan, and integrate that in your study plan and guide. So for example, if you know that taking a walk helps you to clear your head, include in your self-care plan a way to take a walk before or after you study. Also, finding ways to bookend your study process can be very helpful. So for example, you might have like a little ritual that helps you to feel like to feel better about the process, to really get into it. For example, some people light a candle, put on soothing music, settle in a very comfortable space, make it as positive as possible. Do whatever you need to do to put yourself in that mood to like feel good and to focus. And then when you've done it, so when you set aside whatever time you have for the day to study, when you've done that, do something to celebrate what you've accomplished. Maybe it's a small daily thing. Maybe like I'm gonna celebrate by reading my book for 15 minutes after I've studied to just kind of clear my mind, or enjoying like a piece of chocolate or a good coffee or something after you're done. So whatever you can do to provide that kind of positive reinforcement during the study process is really helpful. Also, this is related to what I said before. Think about how and where you'll take the exam, and work with your advisor on this. And once that's been decided, visit the space. So maybe it's a conference room in Rick's. Visit the space, see what it's going to be like. See what the chairs are. Sit in the chairs. Make sure the chairs feel comfortable to you. And when you're taking your actual exam, maybe you want to bring like a coffee with you, or like I said, wear your very comfortable clothes. If you need some sort of like a fidget or a small item to soothe or ground you, like again, talk with your advisor. These are things that can help you to make that study space or make that exam space better. And then I will say, think about what you will do after you turn in or after you complete each of your exams. So, mine was, I wanted a delicious meal that I don't usually eat after each of my exam. And they weren't expensive. I had never gotten a whole bucket of chicken for myself from KFC, and I wanted that. And that was I don't remember which exam it was, but I got a bucket of chicken. And, we did something really good to like mark each time, because I was, in case you can't tell, like I'm a little, I was anxious about my exams, and, it's just, academia, like, we are a lot of times perfectionist people who come into a discipline or come into a world where, you know, it can feel, yeah, it feels it. So we in our department are trying to like get away from that as much as possible and be supportive, but it's still hard, you know, it's still hard. So do something that makes you feel good to mark off and celebrate that you've checked each of these. And that's honestly all that I have. And I want to open it up for questions, and then really want to tell you all, there are some snacks here, but I really want to tell you all that you're amazing and you're wonderful and that we are here for you. And I know that exams, I feel like all that I've said is that how hard they are, but they really are, it's such an important part in your career. To really, it's a time to bring everything together and to see, wow, this is all, these are, I know a lot, and you do know a lot, and you are going to show us that you know a lot. And we are really proud already, even though you haven't even done it yet, of all of the things that you've done. So that's all that I have, and I'll open it up for questions or for comments or thoughts from you all. Does anyone have a favorite like study practice that you do? A favorite self-care study practice, I should say.
I really like to play with my dog and study for a long time, like go on a walk or go in the backyard or something.
Yes, a pet.
Yeah.
All right, well, I'm gonna turn off the recording. I will stick around for a minute in case anybody has any questions. But thank you all for joining us. And like I said, we are going to, we're gonna be sharing more materials in a Google Drive for you all. And we'll be updating the handbook very soon related to the exams. But hopefully this was a helpful session to help you just get started on thinking about how to study.